My neighbors came to our house every day for several years. They came to our house as if it was their own and bothered us with their problems. I couldn't live like that anymore, so that's what I did next. It all began innocently enough. A neighbor, whom we barely knew at the time, knocked on the door one afternoon. My wife, ever the kind-hearted soul, invited her in for a cup of tea and a chat. The woman stayed for a little over an hour, talking about everything from her cat's health problems to how much she hated the landlord. My wife smiled, nodded, and listened politely while I quietly stayed out of the way, thinking it was just a one-time visit. But it wasn't. She came back the next day. No knock this time, just walked in like she owned the place. She brought her nephew, who immediately asked if we had any snacks. My wife, tired from her night shift at the hospital, obliged and handed over a bag of chips while muttering something about boundaries. Then it became a pattern. Day after day, this neighbor would show up, sometimes with her kids, sometimes with her cousin, sometimes with someone we never met. They'd sit on our couch, ask for coffee or tea, and turn on the TV like it was their own. The worst part? They wouldn't leave. Not until we practically begged them to. And even then, it felt like they were doing us a favor by walking out the door. At first I tried to talk to my wife about it. "This is getting out of hand," I said. "We can't keep letting them come in here whenever they feel like it." But she'd just sigh, too exhausted from work to argue. "What am I supposed to do? Tell them they're not welcome? It's not that easy." And so it went. The visits went from unpleasant to downright maddening. They no longer knocked, even as a courtesy. It was as if our 2-bedroom apartment had been listed as a public meeting place. Some days I'd come home from work to find 3 or 4 of them sprawled on our couch, munching on snacks from our pantry, while their kids scurried around like they owned the place. One time I walked into the bathroom, toothbrush in hand, and there was the neighbor's nephew sitting on the edge of the tub, playing with a rubber ducky. "Hey," he said casually, as if this was completely normal. "Hey," I shouted. "What are you doing here anyway?" "Your wife said it was okay," he replied with a shrug before going back to splashing water everywhere. My blood pressure shot up. I stormed into the living room to find my wife sitting with the neighbor, ranting about her landlord again. My wife looked at me and immediately read the frustration on my face. But instead of addressing me, she just gave me a helpless shrug. Another time, I came home to find my slippers missing. It turned out that the neighbor's cousin had borrowed them because her feet were cold. I had to practically wrestle them back, and even then they were unapologetic. The worst part? They'd raid our refrigerator like it was a buffet. My wife would stock up on food, only to have half of it gone by the end of the week. I once caught one of them taking the last piece of my favorite cake and muttering, "You don't need it anyway." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. My wife's job at the hospital had accustomed her to dealing with difficult people, so she just tolerated it, and I felt I had to do the same. But every day my patience was wearing thin. Things just got worse from there. At this point, it felt like the neighbors were part of our house uninvited, unwelcome, and completely unaware of how intrusive they were. One morning I awoke to the sound of frying. For a moment I thought my wife was making breakfast. But when I went into the kitchen, I found the neighbor's cousin flipping eggs in our frying pan. She looked up at me as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Oh, hey," she said. "I thought I'd make myself something since you didn't have much ready." I stood there stunned. "You didn't think to ask?" She laughed like I'd made a joke. "It's just eggs. Don't worry, I'll leave some for you." That was the breaking point for me. I stormed into the bedroom, furious, and woke up my wife. She sat up groggy, trying to make sense of my ramblings about eggs and strangers in the kitchen. "I'll talk to them," she said, rubbing her temples. But we both knew she wouldn't. Later that week, another incident occurred. The bathroom door wouldn't latch properly. It had been on our repair list forever, but it kept getting pushed aside. I was in the middle of a shower when the neighbor's nephew burst in. He was holding a tablet and announced that he needed the Wi-Fi password again. "Get out!" I yelled, almost slipping on the wet floor in my panic to cover up. He just blinked at me. "But you're already using the bathroom," he said, as if that excused his invasion. That night I told my wife that we had to lock the front door from now on. She agreed, but the next day the neighbors called her and said one of them was feeling faint and needed to rest in our apartment. So, of course, she let them in again. The worst part? They kept bringing more people. At one point, there were 6 of them in our tiny apartment watching TV and eating snacks while my wife and I sat silently in the corner, defeated. By now, our 2-room apartment felt less like a home and more like a public lounge. The neighbors had no shame, and their sense of entitlement seemed to grow by the day. I came home one afternoon to find the living room completely rearranged. The couch was moved, the coffee table was pushed against the wall, and our chairs were lined up like a makeshift theater. The neighbors' kids were sitting in them, munching popcorn and watching cartoons on our TV. I stood there in disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" "Oh," one of the neighbors chirped from the kitchen, where she was rummaging through the refrigerator. "We're just setting up a little movie time for the kids. You don't mind, do you?" I couldn't even answer. I just walked into the bedroom and closed the door. Later that night, as I was trying to relax, my wife came home from work looking completely drained. I barely had time to tell her about the theater setup, before we were interrupted by another knock at the door. Actually, no, it wasn't a knock. It was a push. The door swung open and in walked another neighbor, this one clutching a laundry basket. "Hey, can I borrow your washer? Ours broke down again." My wife sighed. "We're really not." But before she could finish, the neighbor had dumped her clothes on the floor and started loading the washer. "You're a lifesaver," she called over her shoulder, as if we'd enthusiastically agreed. I watched as my wife pinched the bridge of her nose, clearly on the verge of losing it. "We need to set some rules," I whispered. "No," she said flatly. The neighbors were relentless. Privacy? That was a distant memory. They didn't just drop by unannounced, they acted as if they were entitled to every nook and cranny of our lives. One night, I was sitting on the couch, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. My wife was still at work, and for the first time in weeks, the apartment was quiet. But of course it didn't last. The front door creaked open, and in came 2 of the neighbors with a tray of leftover lasagna. "We thought you might be hungry," one of them announced, setting the tray down on the counter. I stared at them, stunned. "I didn't ask for lasagna." "Well," she said with a grin, "you've been looking a little thin lately. Thought we'd help." Skinny? I wasn't sure whether to be insulted or grateful. But before I could respond, her nephew and his friend burst in behind her and made a beeline for the refrigerator. They didn't even ask, they just grabbed sodas, plopped down on the couch, and started arguing about what to watch on TV. When my wife came home, I was sitting in the bedroom, avoiding the chaos in the living room. She came in, looking as exhausted as ever, and asked, "Why are there 6 people out there?" "They brought lasagna," I muttered. She dropped her bag on the floor and flopped onto the bed. "This has got to stop." "Really?" I said sarcastically. "You think?" The next day things continued to escalate. One of the neighbors was having a small birthday party at her apartment, and instead of keeping it there, she decided it would be more fun to bring it to ours. Without asking, I came home to balloons, streamers, and a group of kids running through the hallway like they were at an amusement park. "This is the last straw," I muttered to myself. But when I mentioned it to my wife, she just sighed and said, "We'll figure it out." Even our children began to realize how ridiculous the situation had become. One night, our oldest daughter, Emma, sat me and my wife down. She wasn't one for confrontation, but she looked absolutely fed up. "Mom, Dad, this isn't normal," she said, her voice firm. "You have to tell them to leave. This is our home, not a community center." My wife sighed and rubbed her temples. "I know, honey, but it's not that easy. What are we supposed to do? Lock the doors and ignore them?" Emma didn't even hesitate. "Yes. Exactly that. Or at least start charging them rent." My younger daughter, Lily, chimed in from the doorway. Seriously, Dad, they're here more than we are. I couldn't even do my homework yesterday because one of their kids was using my desk to draw. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but what could I say? They were right. The neighbors had taken over our lives, and we were letting them. But despite the pep talk from our children, nothing changed. It wasn't that we didn't want to kick the neighbors out, it was that we didn't know how to say no. They always had an excuse to stop by, and my wife's kind heart made it impossible for her to turn anyone away, especially when they mentioned they were tired or just needed a quick rest. Weeks turned into months, and the routine continued. Neighbors dropped in whenever they pleased, raiding our refrigerator and occupying our living room. Their children treated our apartment like a playground, scattering toys and crumbs everywhere. The worst part? They didn't even seem to notice or care how much they were inconveniencing us. Once, their cousin threw her laundry on our couch and said she'd be back in an hour to pick it up. She didn't return for 2 days. Our youngest daughter, Lily, had had enough. One night at dinner, she slammed her fork down and said, "If you're not going to throw her out, I'm going to do it myself." I laughed nervously, but she wasn't kidding. "They don't even knock," she said, her voice rising. "You know what happened today?" I was in the bathroom and the neighbor's kid just walked in like it was nothing. I was mortified. Emma supported her. "That's not fair to us. We're supposed to feel safe and comfortable in our home, and instead we're stuck with half the neighborhood." My wife and I exchanged guilty looks. We knew they were right. But even then, we didn't do anything. We let it go for another year. As another year passed, things got completely out of hand. Neighbors came and went as they pleased, bringing more people than ever. We'd lost control of our own home. One day I came home to find one of the neighbors' uncles sleeping on our couch. I didn't even know the guy's name. He was snoring so loudly that I thought the walls were vibrating. Next to him, 2 kids were playing an obnoxiously loud game on their tablets, and our refrigerator door was wide open, with one of their teenagers standing there, casually eating a sandwich he hadn't asked for. I walked into the kitchen and opened my mouth to say something, but what was there to say? These people had no boundaries, and we hadn't done anything to enforce them. I just sighed and went to the bedroom to find some peace, but even that was impossible. The neighbor's cousin had decided to fold her laundry on our bed because there was more room. Later that night, Emma came home from her boyfriend's house. She barely looked at us as she grabbed a plate of leftovers and sat down at the kitchen counter. "Still no change, huh?" she said, not even bothering to hide her disappointment. We didn't answer. "I'm telling you," she added, "this is why I'm never here. I can't live like this." She wasn't exaggerating. Emma had practically moved in with her boyfriend at this point, and I couldn't blame her. The apartment was crowded, chaotic, and far from the home it should be. The breaking point came a few days later. I was watching TV, trying to relax after work, when one of the neighbors barged in with her entire extended family. They didn't even say hello, they just plopped down on the couch and started flipping through the channels like it was their TV. "I need a drink," the neighbor said, heading for the refrigerator. "You have soda, right?" I stared at her, my patience hanging by a thread. "Do you even live here?" I finally asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. She looked at me, unimpressed. "What's with the attitude? We're like family." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed into the bedroom and told my wife, "We're leaving. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs, we're getting out of here." When I made the decision to move, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But that relief was short-lived because now came the hard part, actually making it happen without the neighbors finding out. The first challenge was convincing my wife to go through with it. She was hesitant, as always, worried about how the neighbors would react. "They'll find out eventually," I said, trying to reassure her. "But we'll be long gone by then." We decided to keep the plan a secret, even from our children, until everything was in place. The last thing we needed was for one of the neighbors to overhear and try to guilt us into staying. The next step was to find a new place to live. We didn't just want to move, we wanted to disappear, at least from this circle of nosy intruders. So we looked at apartments further away, in a neighborhood where no one knew us. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued their antics, completely oblivious. They'd show up unannounced, as usual, and treat our apartment like their personal clubhouse. One day, while I was secretly packing some boxes, one of them came in and asked if we had an extra cell phone charger. "You're kidding, right?" I said, barely looking up. "No, why?" she replied, dead serious. Another day, I caught the neighbor's nephew snooping in our hall closet. "What are you doing?" I asked, barely able to hide my annoyance. "Looking for board games," he said casually. "You guys have better ones than we do." It was like living in a sitcom, except the humor was slowly being replaced by sheer frustration. We managed to find a new place within a few weeks, but we didn't tell a soul. We started packing late at night, quietly sneaking boxes out to the car so the neighbors wouldn't notice. Every trip felt like a secret mission, and I couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. The day we finally decided to move out was like preparing for a military operation. We got up at dawn to get a head start, knowing that the neighbors wouldn't show up until mid-morning. By then, we hoped to have most of the boxes out and loaded into the truck. We worked quietly, pushing boxes into the hallway and down to the moving van parked outside. Emma and Lily were now in on the plan and were more than happy to help. "Good riddance," Emma muttered as she carried out a pile of books. But of course, things didn't go as smoothly as planned. Around 9 a.m., the first neighbor arrived. It was Carla, the self-proclaimed queen of borrowing everything we owned. She sauntered in as usual, holding a bag of muffins. "Oh, are you having a party? Why didn't you tell me?" My wife froze in the middle of the elevator. I stepped in quickly, trying to play it cool. Not exactly. We're just, reorganizing a bit." "Reorganizing?" Carla squinted at the boxes stacked near the door. "Looks like you're packing." At that moment, my wife panicked. "We're just, getting rid of some old stuff," she blurted out, clearly grasping at straws. Carla didn't seem convinced. She put the muffins on the counter and started rummaging through the boxes. "You're not moving, are you?" she asked, suspicion in her voice. Before I could answer, Lily jumped in. "Yep, we are. Moving far, far away." My wife shot her a look, but the damage was done. Carla gasped and immediately ran out the door. "I have to tell everyone." Panic set in. Within minutes, a parade of neighbors showed up demanding to know what was going on. They barged in, looked through boxes, and started asking questions as if we owed them an explanation. "You can't leave," one of them shouted. "What are we going to do without you? Find someone else's fridge to raid," Emma muttered, drawing a stifled laugh from Lily. The apartment turned into a madhouse. Neighbors swarmed in, talking over each other, peeking into boxes, and throwing questions at us faster than we could answer. "You can't move," one neighbor wailed. "What about movie nights? And who's going to let me borrow their Wi-Fi?" another chimed in. "I still have laundry to pick up," Carla shrieked, clutching a random shirt she'd apparently left behind weeks ago. My wife stood frozen, clearly overwhelmed. Emma and Lily stayed by the door, ready to block anyone who tried to help unpack the moving van. I, however, had reached my limit. "All right, everybody out," I yelled, clapping my hands for emphasis. The room fell silent as all the neighbors turned to look at me, eyes wide. "Out," I repeated, pointing at the door. "This is our home, and we're leaving. You've had your free run for years, and we're done. So please, go bother someone else." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, they reluctantly shuffled toward the door, muttering things like, "ungrateful," and, "Well, excuse us." Carla was the last to leave, grabbing her muffins on the way out with a dramatic sigh. As soon as the door closed, the room erupted in relieved laughter. Even my wife cracked a smile, finally seeing the humor in the chaos. "That was intense," she said, leaning against the counter. "No kidding," Emma added, rolling her eyes. I half expected them to chain themselves to the furniture. With the neighbors gone, we wasted no time loading the last of the boxes. The kids helped carry the smaller items while I hauled out the heavier ones, fueled by sheer determination. By late afternoon, the apartment was empty. We stood in the living room one last time, taking in the silence a sound we hadn't heard in years. "Let's get out of here," I said, and my family eagerly followed me out the door. As we pulled out of the parking lot for the last time, I looked at the building in my rearview mirror. The place that had been our home for years didn't feel like home at all. It was a constant source of frustration, noise, and endless intrusion. Driving away felt like breaking out of prison. It wasn't just the neighbors that made it unbearable. It was the fact that we had let it happen. For years we'd sacrificed our peace and privacy, letting people walk all over us in the name of politeness. But now, as we drove to our new apartment across town, I realized how much we missed. The new place was a dream. Quiet, cozy, and most importantly, private. No one stopped by unannounced. No kids raiding the refrigerator. No cousins folding laundry on our bed. For the first time in years, we were able to breathe. My wife, who had been hesitant about the move, finally admitted that it was the right decision. I didn't realize how exhausting it was until it stopped. She said one evening as we sat in our blissfully empty living room, Emma, who had practically moved out during the chaos, was coming back to live with us. I might actually stay this time. She joked, but we knew she wasn't kidding. Lily seemed happier too, no longer forced to share her space with random kids. She even started inviting her own friends over, something she hadn't done in years. And me? I finally felt like I had my life back. I could sit on my own couch without worrying about finding a stranger there. I could eat my snacks without someone else taking the last piece. It was the little things that made all the difference. Looking back, I can't believe we put up with it for so long. The endless stream of neighbors, the lack of boundaries, the sheer audacity of some of their behavior. It was a nightmare disguised as hospitality. But now life is peaceful. And if there's one thing I know for sure, it's this: I'll never leave my door unlocked again.